Today we're going to talk about slavery in the New World, in the Americas. Slavery was as old as humankind. In every civilization that historians and archaeologists and anthropologists have ever studied, all the way back to the most ancient that we have recorded history for, slavery existed in those places. Now, in ancient times, though, slavery was generally a type of servantship that was the fate of people captured in war. Slavery might also be the result of owing money. If you could not pay your debts in ancient Rome, for example, you would become a slave to the person you owed money to until that debt was paid. But what's fascinating is that in ancient times, slaves were treated as human beings. Slaves could progress out of slavery. Slavery was not for one's lifetime. It was only in the New World, in the Americas, that the idea evolved that slaves were a type of property who could be bought and sold like a piece of real estate. The first evidence of slaves in the New World can be found in 1502 with notations that African slaves were indeed on Spanish sugar plantations in the West Indies and the Caribbean islands. The slave trade to the New World then began almost immediately. The Portuguese controlled the slave trade in the early 1500s. The Dutch will gain control of it in the middle of the 1500s, and the English will dominate the slave trade beginning in the 18th century, the 1700s. Slavery was a lucrative business. The country that controlled the slave trade could become very wealthy. Slavery in North America, in the British colonies, began because of a serious shortage of labor in the first English colonies, such as Virginia, Maryland, where tobacco farming had taken off so quickly in the 1600s. But we should note that the British did not turn immediately to slave labor to solve their labor problems. They first turned to indentured servants. An indentured servant was a man or woman who agreed to serve a planter for a specified number of years in return for the planter paying for the servant's passage to America. Now, in theory, this was a win-win situation. There were a lot of landless, unemployed people in England and later other parts of Europe who wanted to come to these colonies but could not afford to pay their way. Indenture, then, was a way for people to get to America, to come to the colonies. The term of service was usually between 4 to 7 years, depending on the contract, on the agreement, but at the end of that service, the servant became free. If they lived that long. And that's an issue because we talked about Jamestown. We talked about how high the mortality rate was in the first decades of that colony. Up until the middle of the 1600s, for example, 4 out of every 5 indentured servant will die within 5 years of coming to America. So most indentured servants don't live long enough to be free. But if they were lucky, if they survived indenture, America held the promise of a better life. America held the promise of a chance to own their own land, new opportunities in the New World. Now, I said it was a win-win situation. The servant gets to America. Hopefully, they'll live long enough to be free. What does the planter get? First of all, labor. Right? You got the guarantee of this servant's labor for however many years your contract had called for, but also they can get land. Because remember the head right system. The head right system in Virginia, right? You're going to receive 50 acres of land for every person whose passage you pay to the colony. And so planters were able to increase their land holdings by sponsoring indentured servants to America and solve their labor problems at the same time. We should note that in the years between the early 1600s, as Jamestown was established, and the American Revolution in 1776, it's estimated that between 1/2 and 2/3 of all the white men who immigrated to the colonies came originally as indentured servants. Now, we should note that indenture today is against international law. Indenture is considered a type of slavery. But this will be a way that a lot of Europeans will come to America in these early years of the colonies. But what we're going to see is that eventually, over the course of the 1600s, the practice of indentured servitude began to decrease. And more over that century, the practice of using slaves for labor will begin. Let's note that the first African slaves appeared in the British colonies in 1619. About 400 African slaves came to the colony of Virginia. Now, at first, their status seemed to be similar to indentured servants. It's believed that these first African slaves were probably freed after a period of time. But gradually, over the course of the 1600s, the practice will evolve that slaves will never be freed, and that the condition of slavery would be passed on to the children of those slaves. So let's take a look at 3 reasons why slavery will replace indenture in the British colonies. The first is economic. Note the last point on this slide. Indentured servants were initially more desirable than slaves. That's because they were cheaper. One of the reasons that planters used indentured servants instead of slaves in the early 1600s was because indentured servants were just flat cheaper. Slaves were expensive. And there didn't seem to be any reason to purchase an expensive slave when most everybody was dying out in those first decades of the Virginia colonies. As we said, 4 out of every 5 indentured servant will die in the first 5 years of coming to America. That actually held true for anyone, free, slave, or indenture. So indentured bringing indentured servants over, again at a lower cost than slaves, seemed to make sense if people are going to die within a few years of coming to the colonies. However, after the mid-1600s, beginning around 1650, 1660 or so, we start to see people in the British colonies living longer, better diets, most likely, acclimation to the environment. But once people begin living longer and complete their indentured servitude and go on to be free, then it became more cost-effective to buy a slave for his or her lifetime. That way you don't have to keep buying new indentured servants over and over again. You can make that one-time bigger investment in a slave that will be your slave for their entire lifetime. A slave whose status of slavery will pass on to their children. You never have to worry about what's going to happen when a slave's term of service ends. Their term of service never ended. The second reason why slavery came to replace indentured servitude in the 1600s, social unrest. Social unrest among freed indentured servants, specifically an event known as Bacon's Rebellion. And we want to understand that over the course, again, after the middle of the 1600s, indentured servants began to live longer and finish their term of service and become free. Now, those freed indentured servants, of course, want to buy land. They want land that they can then begin their own plantations on, their own tobacco plantations, for example. But at the same time that we start seeing people living longer in the colonies, the price of land also began to increase. And it was harder and harder for these freed indentured servants to be able to afford land. And as a result, especially in Virginia, you're going to see a lot of freed indentured servants who have no employment, who have no land, who are wandering the countryside, living hand to mouth, squatting on land to grow a little tobacco, stealing hogs, just trying to get by. And as that number of freed indentured servants began to grow, more and more unrest began to develop. And we're going to see it come to a head in 1676 in this event known as Bacon's Rebellion. In the 1670s, the government of Virginia, again with the capital of Jamestown, the colony of Virginia had decided to set aside some land for the Chesapeake natives. Now, they're not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it to avoid wars with natives. But what we see is a lot of freed indentured servants who are pretty upset about this. Why is the colonial government going to give land to the Chesapeake natives? Why don't they give it to us? We served out our term of indenture. That land should be available for us. And under the leadership of Nathaniel Bacon, who was not an indentured servant, by the way, but under the leadership of Nathaniel Bacon, we're going to see in 1676 a rebellion breaking out against the Chesapeake natives. Bacon and his band of freed servants will attack the Chesapeakes and then take their rebellion to the colonial capital of Virginia, burning the capital of Jamestown. Now, shortly after the capital burned, Bacon dies. Some sudden disease. And without their leader, the rebellion fell apart. But we should note that Bacon's rebellion was the largest rebellion in colonial history up until the Revolution. And as a result, you're going to see a lot of Virginians beginning to question whether or not they should continue to bring indentured servants to the colony. If there's no land for them, if there's nothing for them to be able to do once they finish their indenture, why are we continuing to bring them over? They're just going to cause more social unrest, more rebellions. And so they turn to slavery. Once again, they'll never have to worry about what slaves will do after they're freed. Slaves would never be freed. And the third reason that slavery came to replace indenture is just plain racism. Europeans enslaved Africans because they believed Africans to be an inferior race. It's the genesis of the ideas of white supremacy. European religion backed up these ideas of black inferiority. The Old Testament story of Ham, for example, Ham, the son of Noah. Ham saw Noah naked and was cursed to a life of servitude, and his children would be dark-skinned. And so when Europeans encountered Africans, dark-skinned people, they assumed, the children of Ham, the descendants of Ham, slaves, fit to be slaves. The European arrogance that we noted when we looked at Columbus and his reaction to the Native Americans. Different cultures, different ways of living, less technology than the Europeans had. They just simply assumed that Africans living very different lives and cultures than the Europeans did were fit for nothing more than slavery. This sense of superiority that Europeans will create to rationalize the enslavement of human beings is a huge and major factor in the development of slavery in the New World. We should also note that English law, or British law rather, in the colonies will also come to codify or bake slavery into the colonial legal system. And as you do the reading for your journal this week, you'll note the slave codes that were passed in Virginia. Slave codes were laws to regulate the behavior of slaves. And in the case of the readings that you're going to be that you'll be doing and writing about in your journal, the laws also will regulate the types of punishments meted out to slaves. As those slave codes were passed in British America, it simply made slavery an intrinsic part of the system that really leads to the institutionalized racism that we still strive to overcome today. So as you read those slave codes and write your journals, again, think about what they're trying to do in Virginia with these laws. And what's the point of mandating specific punishments and numbers of lashes on the bare back for relatively minor offenses? What is the point of the laws that they were passing in the 16 and 1700s, if not to simply bake slavery into the system of the British colonies? And we should note that every colony will eventually have a set of slave codes in place, not just Virginia, but in all the 13 colonies. In other colonies, you're going to see laws, for example, mandating that the children of slaves would be slaves themselves. That slave quarters would be searched every couple of weeks as they're going to be looking for anything that slaves might use to undermine the system or rebel. There were laws in colonies that mandated whites could not trade with slaves. They could not do business with slaves. They had to go through that slave's master if they wanted to employ a slave to do work for them. And laws were also passed mandating that more than 2 or 3 slaves could not gather together without white supervision, fearful that groups could perhaps hatch plots against the masters. Laws were passed restricting the education that slaves could be given. Now, the law mandating or the law restricting the numbers of slaves that could gather without whites' supervision, that law resulted in part from a slave rebellion that occurred in South Carolina in 1739, a rebellion known as the Stono Rebellion. Slaves in the South Carolina community near the Stono River were attempting to get to Florida. Florida was a Spanish colony, and Florida was offering freedom to slaves that could get to their colony from the English colonies. And so we find that in 1739, a group of South Carolina slaves rebelled as they attempted to make that escape to Florida. In the course of their rebellion, 25 colonists were killed. The Stono Rebellion was the largest slave rebellion in colonial America. All of the slaves in the rebellion were captured and executed. Once again, this rebellion created fear among whites in South Carolina. In the colony of South Carolina, slaves outnumbered white inhabitants. And so they passed laws, they passed slave codes. Keep the slaves from meeting together. Keep the slaves from plotting rebellion. Who knows what they're talking about behind your back? Will you be the next dead colonist? Will you? Keep passing the laws to restrict the behavior, the actions of slaves, to keep the system intact. We want to look at the process by which an African became a slave. This is hard, but we need to understand. The slave trade was triangular in nature. The slave companies, the European businesses that trafficked in human beings would come from Europe to Africa, to West Africa, to purchase slaves to take to the Americas. Most of the slaves in British America came from West Africa. They would be captured by other African tribes or empires who considered those not of their own society to be enemies, to be fair game, to be kidnapped and sold to the Europeans for profit. Once a slave was kidnapped, captured, taken from their homes and their families, they would be marched to the coast, to the west coast of Africa, sometimes a trip of hundreds of miles through steaming jungles, generally tied together at the necks as they walked and walked. Upon reaching the coast, slaves would be sold then to the European slavers. They would be examined by doctors employed by that company. They would be branded with the mark of the company that had bought them. And then they'd be loaded onto the boats. Consider how terrifying that must have been. They don't know what's going to happen to them. Suddenly they are seeing people who look nothing like them, who intend to throw them onto a boat and take them somewhere to do something. Some will try to kill themselves before they will get on that boat, believing that death might be the better option to the unknown. But ultimately, the slaves would be packed onto the slave ships to be sent to America. The Middle Passage is the slave voyage from Africa to America. Again, it's the middle part of this triangle that began in Europe to Africa, and then the Middle Passage is the voyage of the slaves to the Americas. On the boats, the slaves would be shackled, wrist to wrist, and packed on the bare wooden floors of cargo ships into sleeping spaces that left less room than a corpse had in a coffin. Just how many slaves would be packed onto those boats depended on the captain. Many captains of slave ships prided themselves on being tight packers. They wanted to get as many slaves as they possibly could packed into those ships in hopes of big profits once they brought their cargo to the Americas. We should note, however, that the tighter the pack, the more death you would probably have, because diseases would spread faster. There would be less air circulation. There would be less food available for the slaves. Other captains were loose packers. They're going to take fewer slaves per voyage, hoping that more will live. But no matter how many slaves were on these boats, these were miserable conditions on the Middle Passage. Except for meals and exercise, the men were generally kept below deck for the entire trip. Women were allowed on deck, but then they were considered to be fair game to be raped by the sailors on the ship. Slaves were left to lay in their own excrement. Again, there could be diseases that spread through the slave ship that killed massive numbers. Some slaves are going to try to throw themselves overboard on this ship, again, choosing maybe to try to escape their fate through death. But if food ran out, if food began to dwindle as the voyage continued, sometimes slaves would simply be thrown overboard to die. One ship's doctor reported that he could not stay below deck for more than 15 minutes without fainting because of the heat and the stench in the cargo holds, as hundreds of slaves suffered through the Middle Passage. Generally, we find that 15 to 33% of the slaves will die on the Middle Passage. And it's said that if you drained the Atlantic Ocean of water, you could follow the Middle Passage by simply tracking the bones of slaves that had died and were thrown overboard, or were thrown overboard and then died. But you can track the Middle Passage by the trail of bones in the Atlantic Ocean. Most of the slaves from Africa went to Spanish colonies or the Portuguese colony of Brazil, as you can see from this map. It is estimated that between 10 million and 15 million Africans were kidnapped, enslaved, and transported from Africa to the Americas. Large numbers going to the Caribbean islands of the Spanish sugar plantations, tobacco plantations throughout Central and South America as well. It's estimated that about 400,000 Africans came to the British colonies in North America. But by the time of the Civil War, by 1860, there'll be 4 million slaves in America. And so the growth of slavery in the United States was primarily the result of natural reproduction. Again, the children of slaves would become slaves themselves. How do you cope with that? How do you cope with being kidnapped from everything you've known, taken from your family, your friends, your community, branded, sold, shipped off across an ocean, and forced to work? Many will resist, subtly, because remember, if you resist overtly, you may end up being whipped severely. And so perhaps all the slaves on a particular plantation or farm might just decide to work a little slower. An act of resistance. Put a kink in the workflow. They could engage in sabotage, arson, burn down a barn. Because before all the fancy forensics that we have today, who'll know that fire was set by slaves? Some slaves had knowledge of medicinal herbs. They knew what berries, what mushrooms and toadstools were poisonous or not. They might sneak those poisonous ones into the kitchen. And over time, they could sicken or maybe even kill the masters who had enslaved them. But most slaves just had to figure out how to survive. And so religion was important in providing strength to enslaved peoples. Family was important. A slave could pass their stories down to their children, telling them what they might have remembered from Africa, where they were taken, telling them of the names of their ancestors, passing down their stories from generation after generation after generation to provide a sense of connection to enslaved people. Other slaves on a plantation or farm could support each other, comforting, caring for each other, being there for each other, building communities as best they could to survive. We want to understand that slavery existed in every single one of the 13 colonies that became the United States. And in this map, we'll give you an idea of of the numbers of slaves in the various colonies in 1770. 4,000 slaves in Massachusetts, almost 200,000 in Virginia, 3,000 in Little Rhode Island. The vast majority of slaves were in the South, working the fields, growing tobacco, rice, sugar, later cotton. But at the time of the American Revolution, when independence was declared from Britain in 1776, let's just note 22% of the total colonial population were enslaved people. Almost a quarter of the people living in those colonies that became the United States were not free. And so the existence of slavery in British America, in the United States, flew in the face of the rhetoric of the revolutionary leaders. Jefferson, Washington, Adams, they spoke of equality, Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, except for the 22% of their numbers who were enslaved. Slavery is America's greatest hypocrisy. Slavery is America's greatest shame. Slavery will eventually tear the country apart, bring the nation to civil war. It took that war in the middle of the 1800s to finally abolish slavery in the United States. But the legacy of slavery, the legacy of institutionalized racism, is something that we as Americans must still deal with today.